Anin Dante, hello everybody, and welcome to Sekona Getso. My name is Lianne Simpson, and I am an instructor and board member at the Dechinta Center for Learning, for Research and Learning, and I'm facilitating this series. I'm coming to you from my own territory today, Aki. Dechinta's head office is located in the gorgeous territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation, and we would not exist as an organization without their generosity, patience, expertise, and their magnificent understanding of their homeland. I would like to welcome you all to this space. At Dechinta, we are brought together by our care for the land, each other, and our desire to revitalize and practice Indigenous ways of knowing and being. Dechinta is dedicated to creating a future of Indigenous cultural revitalization through a reconnection with the land. Through our programs, we
recording in progress.
Northern Indigenous communities that are radically self-determining, healthy, sustainable, and connected to Indigenous knowledge and practices. We aim to ensure that the education we offer is accessible to all community members, including parents, youth, women, and Two-Spirit, trans, and queer people. We have a mandate to serve the needs of Northern Indigenous populations through education, research, and community programs. We are mandated to deliver Indigenous-centered art, culture, language, and educational program in an innovative land-based environment. We have a commitment to build education capacity and employment opportunities for students and youth in Northern Indigenous communities. We aim to increase the accessibility of land-based programming for school-age youth, young adults transitioning out of high school and into post-secondary employment, and their families. The Sekona Getso, or Women Are Strong Speaker Series, is meant to be a spotlight and a celebration of the incredible work Northern Indigenous women are doing as scholars, researchers, parents, artists, activists, and writers. In these pandemic times, it's also meant to be a space of respect and connection, of inspiration and affirmation in the North and beyond. So I invite all of you today to create with me a supportive, kind, and respectful environment for our speaker and for all of our participants. I will be facilitating a curated question and answer section at the end of the talk. So please type your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. Mary Rose Sundberg, founder of Goyadiko and Leda, translated the name of our series for us, and I'm grateful to Mero for her support and for her audio clip, Masi Cho. Collective Broadcast is an artist-run collective specializing in live streaming and tech solutions for arts organizations and not-for-profits, and they are helping us with the tech side of things today. Sydney Krill made the fantastic posters and is also helping me facilitate. And of course, our executive director, Dr. Kelsey Reisman, also, as always, as providing all kinds of support to make this series happen. We're very honored today that you're able to join us. We are recording the webinar, and we'll be posting the webinars on our website after our speakers are finished. Our first speaker, Mandy McDonald's talk, is now up on our website. I'm not sure if the YouTube link that I put into the chat is working, but we'll be checking in on that. Our next event is going to be November 3rd, 12 till 1, Yellowknife time, and we are so honored to be hosting Crystal Gale Fraser, who will be speaking on histories of residential schools in the North during the era of reconciliation. Today, I'm so very honored to have Lianne Marie Leda Charlie joining us today from Whitehorse. Lianne is Wolf Clan and Tagecho Kudan, or Northern Tutchone speaking people of the Yukon. She was born in Whitehorse to her mother, Luana Larson, and late father, Peter Andrew Charlie. Her maternal grandparents are Donna Olsen of Danish ancestry and Benedict Larson of Icelandic ancestry. And her paternal grandparents are Leda Jimmy of Little Salmon River, and Big Salmon Charlie of Big Salmon River. She has created community murals in Whitehorse, Alutga, Sambake, and Mayo, and co-created 4 pieces for To Talk with Others, including a life-size hot pink paper mache bull moose made out of the Yukon umbrella final agreement. Lianne is our newest faculty member with the Dechinta Center of Research and Learning, and I'm just so honored to welcome her here today. Hi, Lianne.
Hello. Merci for that introduction. Okay, so that means I start? I guess so. I believe that Scott will share my slides for me. Yes, merci for having me here today. I'm really excited about this opportunity. I am sharing some work from a chapter of my dissertation that I just submitted on a week ago. So this is the first time that I'm putting some of these ideas out into the world, which can feel a little bit intimidating at times, especially when I can't see any of you. I can just see this big pink moose on my screen and the text that hopefully you won't find too boring as I read to you. The main objective of this talk is to give you a general overview of the main argument that I'm making in my dissertation. But then I'm also going to drill down into a particular chapter where we created this moose together, a small group of us. And I'm going to share a little bit of that process with you, and then share the analysis that I came to after looking at our process and the flow of our sort of work arrangement, and then the dynamic of our group. I focus on 6 core members, myself included. So there's 4 Indigenous women and 2 settler women. I'll share now that the process, the research method that I used was participant observation. So that means that I was a participant in the research, but then also watching what was happening around me. And I chose to use ethnographic vignettes. So I chose to write stories about our experience, and to use those stories as the main evidence to back up the claims that I'm making. So I actually spend a little bit of time in this talk reading a number of different stories to you. Lianne basically did my go-to introduction, but I'm going to share some photos just to put a name to, or put a face to some of these names that were shared in the opening. So I'm the daughter of Peter Charlie. His Northern Tutchone name is Chigawa. That's him standing there with his parents, Leda Jimmy and Big Salmon Charlie, and a priest who was actually in Carmack's, that they brought his parents to the residential school, to Lower Post Residential School, to see him. My grandparents wanted to see their kids, so they made arrangements with the priest to bring them down there. The next picture is my dad. He passed away at the age of 35. I used to say that he was a survivor of residential school, but I think the fact that he passed away of quote unquote natural causes at the age of 35 actually doesn't make him a survivor of residential school anymore. That's something that I've just been processing more recently, given the findings, discoveries of this summer. I was raised by my mom, Lianne Larson. She is 2nd generation Canadian of Danish and Icelandic ancestry. And her parents, as Lianne mentioned, are Benedict Larson and Donna Olson. And then I have 2 sisters, Caitlin Charlie and Alitle Nakana. Caitlin's here in Whitehorse with me, and Alitle and my mom are in Victoria. And I have a son, Luca, and my partner, Michael. And we make our home and our living on Kwanlandan and Ta'an Kwachan Council land where the people have cared for this place for millennia. And I feel so lucky to be here and to be amongst the people and to have been to be in relationships where folks have been I don't want to say it's kindness and it's caring relationships, but also that we've reached a point where folks have been willing to share their knowledge with me. So I hold that gently, and I hold that with a lot of responsibility. Next slide, please. Okay, first story. I'm with my partner, Michael, two of my older cousins, Rick and Jesse, and my other cousin's French-Canadian husband, Jacques. We're in Rick's new boat going down Little Salmon River. We are looking for a moose. It's a clear summer evening in our traditional territories in the Yukon. The sun is high and bright. The cool summer wind cuts through my jacket. I scan the river's edge. There was a forest fire here the summer before last. The spruce trees are charred and encircled with fireweed. The bright magenta flowers pop against the black of the burn. I think I see a moose downriver, so I turn to the group from the bow where I'm seated and I flag my cousins. They're all scanning the shoreline and eyeing the bend in the river ahead. No one responds to my silent alarm. They don't register what I see because what has caught my eye is not a moose. It is more likely birds startled into flight, a lichen-covered rock, or a clumping of bushes, which make a dark mass easily mistakable as a moose, especially for my city eyes. Rick cuts the throttle and we slow down. Our wake nudges us forward as small waves roll under the hull. The boat can't get on step. The water level is too low and the new jet engine is sucking in reeds. While Rick and Jesse deal with it, I turn to Jacques next to me and ask, a little embarrassed, "What does a moose look like? What do I look for?" "It's huge and black," he replies. "Its rack kind of glints in the light. You'll know when you see it." You'll know when you see it. I grew up away from my northern Tutchone family and only recently returned after 25 years of being away. I'm on a long journey of reconnection to my family, my culture, and my own indigeneity. This is the hard work of my generation that is experiencing and overcoming one very painful and resounding intergenerational effect of residential school: disconnection. I am learning and practicing how to be a Northern Tutchone woman, mother, and educator. I know that the moose has been central to our lifeways since the beginning of time. It fed us, clothed us, and guided us. The moose is our partner in our agreement with creation. I came to this opportunity to create these pieces because of Valerie Salez, who curated a show called To Talk with Others. We were invited to respond to a particular political moment in Yukon history and create anything that we wanted. And what we ended up creating was a life-size hot pink paper mâché bull moose whose hide is made of the Umbrella Final Agreement, which is the framework that guides modern treaty making in the Yukon. We also made a paper hide. That's the photo in the center, a stretched hide on a frame, indicative of a stage in the moose hide tanning process. The hide is made of the 11 land claims maps, the 11 Yukon First Nations that have signed land claims. And then the final piece is a paper baby belt that is a Northern Tutchone garment used to carry a child on your body and support the child to sit there somewhat effortlessly. All of these items, a moose is usually real, a hide is the real moose's moose hide, and a baby belt is usually made of tanned hide, yet here I've made them all of paper. In my work, I won't go too deeply into this, but in my own work, this idea of paper politics is actually pretty central. So comparing paper politics that we've inherited through modern treaty to the real moose and like the real thing, the real process of tanning hide, the real hide tanned baby belt that we would actually use to carry our children and then continue our life on the land. Just to give you a taste of the argument, the broader argument that I'm putting forward in my dissertation, I'll just read you a couple paragraphs here. The Umbrella Final Agreement structures Indigenous governance and land claims in the Yukon as a settled issue. In the 1970s, Yukon First Nations embarked on a process to address the problems of living under the Indian Act through engaging the Government of Canada in a land claims settlement. 50 years later, under political conditions, Yukon First Nations are trying to make sense of their current political circumstances and how to move forward. Yukon First Nations leaders signed a modern treaty that they thought would address the problems of the Indian Act and position them to walk into an Indigenous future. But in 2021, this is not where they find themselves. Yukon First Nations are learning about, well, simultaneously implementing a state-centric governance model that systematically undermines Indigenous lifeways. There is uncertainty about how to proceed. Under the landmark Umbrella Final Agreement, 11 of the 14 First Nations in the Yukon Territory negotiated comprehensive land claims and self-government agreements with the territorial and federal governments. Celebrated as modern treaties, the final agreements that stem from the UFA exemplify a recent trend in Aboriginal rights movements in Canada, in which the Canadian state negotiates renewed legal and political relationships with Indigenous nations based on mutual recognition and reconciliation. Scholars of resurgence theory, however, argue that rather than liberate Indigenous nations that engage in such approaches, the politics of recognition are state-serving at their core and merely extend the colonial project by repackaging land dispossession as self-determination. At stake in the implementation phase of final agreements is the First Nations' abilities to build their governance systems and stave off the territorial and federal government's interest in and demand for access to natural resources in the North. Whereas recognition politics appear to be a radically new approach to Aboriginal rights and position the Canadian settler state as benevolent, this process only extends the reach of the state deeper into Indigenous lives and politics. By forcing them to conform to state-centric governance practices, further disconnecting Indigenous peoples from creation, which is the source of Indigenous lifeways. So I'm sure that was probably a little bit complex, and unless you're like steeped in this, which I am at the moment, that whole paradigm that I laid out there can seem theoretical and somewhat abstract. And that is the exact reason why I learned through this process of making the art pieces that the art actually does a lot of work for us. These pieces in particular speak to these tensions that I just laid out. Now that's at a very sort of high level, but then make them much more approachable for people to engage with them. And the reason is because a living moose, a tanned moose hide, and a baby belt made from moose hide are items of cultural significance to Northern Tutchone people. In Northern Tutchone ancestral governance systems, the moose, the living moose, is principal. But even as art pieces, the moose, moose hide, and baby belt are recognizable to Northern Tutchone people. Not only are they known and understood culturally, the moose, for example, is also a living, active member in our relationship with creation. The art pieces affirm who we are as Dan, Northern Tutchone peoples. They mirror back to us our living relationship with creation and our own knowledge systems. The art pieces serve as a tangible intervention into modern treaty politics and make visible the colonial worlds in which Indigenous peoples maneuver, while also reminding us that we are living, breathing relational beings. As such, the pieces reveal that the Indigenous present is everything but certain because it is alive. There's a key piece of the art piece, the moose in particular, well, all of them, that I wanted to get at just from a personal perspective. And this is the certainty clause, which is included on page 15 of the UFA, which is a 308-page document. And the certainty clause is a very specific tool that is used by Canada to achieve certainty about land ownership and land use. And prior to the UFA and prior to signing land claims in the Yukon, there was lots of uncertainty about who owned what and where and who could do what and where. And that was the main impetus behind First Nations leaders in the 1970s writing Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow and seeking out a settlement with Canada through its submission to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. However, there is this clause within all of within Canada's comprehensive land claims process called the certainty clause. And I'm just going to read it to you just so you get a sense of what this is saying. Pursuant to the certainty clause, chapter 2, section 2.5.0 of the Umbrella Final Agreement, Yukon First Nations cede, release, and surrender to Her Majesty the Queen in right of Canada all their Aboriginal claims, rights, titles, and interests. Neither that Yukon First Nation nor any person eligible to be a Yukon Indian person it represents, their heirs, descendants, and successors shall, after the effective date of that Yukon First Nations final agreement, assert any cause of action, action for declaration, claim, or demand of whatever kind or nature which they have ever had, now have, or may hereafter have against Her Majesty the Queen in right of Canada, the government of any territory or province, or any person based on any Aboriginal claim, right, title, or interest ceded, released, or surrendered. According to the state, all matters of Yukon First Nations rights and titles are made certain and finalized in perpetuity, which means forever, through the signing and ratification of comprehensive land claims or modern treaties. Now, again, the complexity of, we'll stay on that last slide, please, Scott. The complexity of that alone is, there's a lot here, and we don't necessarily have time to dive in, but this particular art piece includes some of the certainty clause coming in from the side. And this phrase across this top, we still think of the Yukon as our land, kind of puts this idea of ceding, releasing, and extinguishing Aboriginal rights and title in tension with what Yukon First Nations, one, were seeking through the submission of Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, but also what we feel in our hearts about our lands and our territories. I gave this particular image to my auntie, and I was explaining the different elements of it. The woman in the center is twisting a moose hide. And I explained that that's a certainty clause on the bottom and the quote on top. And she asked what the certainty clause was. And I tried my best to explain to her, like, how Canada uses it. And she asked me, one, she hadn't heard of it before. And two, she asked, why would we sign something that said that? And that moment of a realization, like, that my auntie had lived, like, I was old enough to live through and was an adult during the 70s, 80s, and 90s when the land claims were being negotiated, and to then reach this point where we were both sitting in our kitchen and are confronting the certainty clause for the first time together. It was a bit of an awakening for me. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. So the state's certainty clause that cedes, release, and surrenders Aboriginal title to large tracts of land to the Crown in perpetuity, or that's what it does. And while certainty is agreed to on paper by individuals signing contract-like agreements on behalf of nations and future generations, the state's paper-based consent process is precarious. And this is an argument that I thread throughout my dissertation. The fact that Indigenous people remain, refuse, and remember is evidence of the uncertainty embedded within modern treaty and the threat Indigenous peoples pose to the settler state, settler futurities, and settler forms of consent. While Resurgence points out theoretical tensions within recognition politics, I claim that Indigenous aesthetic practices So the art pieces and the practice of making, make these tensions visible by giving them a physicality and a materiality, thus making the nuances of modern treaty accessible, understandable, and refutable in the everyday. So that it gives you a sense of the larger argument. And now I'm going to dip into a chapter to tell you a little bit about the making of the mousse. Yes, thank you. So I led a small group of Indigenous peoples and settlers through the fabrication process. And when completed, the installation toured at art galleries in the Yukon and British Columbia. For 6 weeks, we worked closely together to make the hot pink mousse and the paper hide. Now, having completed the project, interviewed the participants, presented at several galleries, and analyzed our process and experience, I have come to see our mousse making project as an arts-based governance system, one that was created and sustained at an intimate and interpersonal level. This case study, the case study of the mousse making, extends resurgence theory as presented by Lianne Simpson and Glenn Coulthard, in that it exemplifies pragmatic elements of the theory in practice. For example, Indigenous decolonial healing, building and sustaining responsibility-based kinship connections, facilitating settler allyship and an ethic of reciprocity, creating safe, consensual modes of mentorship, and building creative, Indigenous-centric learning environments that focus on harm reduction. As an Indigenous woman who is reconnecting with my family and learning our cultural laws, ethics, and values as Northern Tutchone people, I've been told that our ways are guided by Duli. Duli includes 4 main pillars: caring, sharing, teaching, and respect. But most of my generation is severed from pre-residential school expressions of Duli. We are in a process of healing and rebuilding this core element of our peoplehood. For both pragmatic and felt reasons, I make a connection between how I think my Northern Tutchone grandparents' generation, that grew up before residential schools were established in the Yukon, actioned caring, sharing, teaching, and respect, and the practice of resurgence outlined above. Indigenous aesthetic practices, of which the mousse making project is an example, gave me and the other participants the space to enact another way, a way informed by Duli, with each other, and as such, it is a resurgence project. I turn to the Northern Tutchone family governance model available in stories by Gertie Tom, a Northern Tutchone elder and language speaker. Oh yeah, I told myself I'd read this in Northern Tutchone. Ekeia or Ikii Gyocho Chu, My Country, Big Salmon River. Gertie's stories illustrate how a family governance system is rooted in a deep reciprocal relationship with creation, particularly mousse, and is contingent on a cohesive, skilled family group. Gertie's stories demonstrate how this Northern Tutchone life way is self-sufficient, which makes it fundamentally different than the governance systems Yukon First Nations have inherited from the state. The Euro-Canadian bureaucratic governance systems that Yukon First Nations have inherited from the state through self-government agreements foster dependency, whereas Euro-Canadian bureaucratic governance systems aim to dehumanize systems by removing human elements such as emotion, subjectivity, and relationship. The Northern Tutchone family system is rooted in human and non-human life and intimate relationships. There are similarities between how Gertie's family worked and how we worked on the art project, both of which center the mousse. This is a key parallel to note as Indigenous peoples embark on the journey of recentering creation in their governance systems. Whereas the imposition of Euro-Canadian bureaucratic systems have removed the human, non-human, and creation from its processes, Northern Tutchone traditional governance systems, like Indigenous aesthetic practices, necessitate them. Gertie's family did not need the state. They were largely independent. They collectively had everything they needed to survive and live a good life. What does a journey back to this level of self-sufficiency look like? And how can Indigenous aesthetic practices facilitate this? Gertie's stories show us how self-sufficiency requires a whole host of physical skills, knowledge sets, and a healthy, strong kinship network in which women play integral roles. To illustrate this, I'll read an excerpt from Gertie's book. Gertie and her family were living and hunting around Big Salmon River around the 1940s. They were likely hunting moose all summer and into the early fall. The landscape in this part of northern Tutchone territories is abound with tree-covered rolling hills and rounded, expansive mountains. Gertie's main family camp would have been where the Big Salmon River enters Dechinta, the Yukon River. And this place is currently referred to as Big Salmon Village. Her family group was made up of 8 to 10 individuals living together in small bush camps, sharing tents, duties, and responsibilities. Their daily life and activities were linked to creation. I call this a Northern Tutchone work ethic. Everyone is contributing the skill whole. Their work ethic is gendered and intimately connected to creation in that the moose and other animals, the terrain, the seasons, the waterways are co-determining how Gertie and her family make decisions. When we stayed at Big Salmon a long time ago, we never used to think anything of traveling a long way. We traveled from Big Salmon Village and walked up to the river to Big Bend. That's the bend in the North Fork of Big Salmon River, which is halfway between Quiet Lake and Northern Lake. On the way up, we would just camp and kill moose and dry meat, freighting ahead with the dogs and following behind them. We would keep on doing that until we had enough meat to last us all winter long. We would save hides so that we could make a moose skin boat to go back to Big Salmon. To make a moose skin boat, the ladies sew 3 moose skins together. Then they double the seam over and sew them again. They sew with sinew, and they have to make the sinew strong enough to hold the hide. They sew it, and then they double it and sew it again, so it's double sewing. When they finish the sewing, the men go hunting for the frame to make the boat. They make a frame for the moose hide boat, just like a regular boat frame. When they put the hide over the frame, they don't tie it down too tightly. When the moose skin boat dries up a little, it tightens up, so you have to keep the moose hide loose. Then they put it in the river to test it out. If there is any water coming through, they take the boat out again and then go out and get pitch. They collect lots of pitch and put it in the fire so that it melts down like honey. Then they glue the boat at the places where it is leaking, and that makes it waterproof. After it dries a bit, they're ready to go. We would load up a boat and go down Big Salmon. There were 8 of us in our family, and we would all go down into the boat. It holds lots of meat too. When you travel in a moose skin boat, you can see right through the bottom of the boat. You can see the rocks in the bottom of the river as you travel down. When we reached Big Salmon, we would unload the boat and then take the hide off the frame because we want to save the hides for tanning. Then my mother would soak it and flesh it and thin it down and make it ready to tan for a moose skin. People don't waste anything. They use it all. The hide is a little dirty, but when you smoke it, it is okay. The art project, like the Northern Tutchone governance system available in Gertie's stories, revolves around a small collective's relationship with a moose, yet a moose that we were constructing ourselves. Both governance systems, Gertie's family system and our art-based system, center creation, land, water, seasons, and the non-human world, and the act of making and creating. As such, the moose, living and constructed, is an allegory for Indigenous governance. Unlike the Euro-Canadian bureaucratic systems we've inherited through self-government agreements that seek objectivity and depersonalization, our art-based governance system was reliant upon our subjectivity, humanness, and relationality. Yes, we were making an art project together, but ultimately it was our relationships and how we spent time together that informed the governance system that was emerging from our actions, behaviors, and decisions. The stories are from when we were working on the art project, but they don't always focus on the art project. They highlight moments of connection, discord, and vulnerability. What happens when you put people who don't know each other very well into relationship with each other and hold space for them to be who they are, bring what they have, take what they need, and contribute where they can? Like in a bush camp setting and in Gertie's stories, it is creation or the act of creating that shapes how time is spent. The Indian Act and Euro-Canadian bureaucratic institutions fracture and deny our humanness. They objectify and subjugate elements of our very being as Indigenous peoples and create systems that entrench these foreign ways into our everyday lives to the point that we mistake them as normal. In a self-government context, Yukon First Nations and citizens are turning to paper-based processes and not creation to tell them how to relate to one another. I offer our experience moose making as a reminder of another way, where care for one another as relations comes first. The work of decolonization will require us to familiarize ourselves with ways of being that center care, connection, and responsibility to the point that they become systemic. Many people worked on the moose, but my research focuses on a core 6, 4 Indigenous women and 2 settler women. And I have 2 vignettes to share with you to give you a sense of our relationships. The first one is called Lianne and Sam driving. Oh, and there's a language warning. I park in front of Sam's house and Facebook message her, I'm here. Oh, and I'll start again by saying that Sam is one of the Indigenous participants. I park in front of Sam's house and Facebook message her, I'm here. From where I'm parked, I can see the top of the front door over the snow collecting on the roof of one of the old broken down trucks slumped in the driveway. I glance up from my phone and see the door open and close. Sam walks out between the trucks. She's wearing black skinny jeans and a man's tracksuit jacket. It hangs off her shoulders like it's on a hanger. She's wearing a black ball cap. It's pulled down low on her brow. She just needs to tilt her head down a few degrees and her whole face disappears behind the brim. She gets in the car. When she closes the door, an invisible cloud of cigarette smoke overcomes me. Hi, I say, handing her a double-double I picked up for her along the way. Hey, she mumbles, thanks. I rack my brain for what to say next. Her long legs stretch out in front of her. Her black high tops are undone. I feel massive next to her and ridiculously overdressed in my knee-length down coat. How is she warm in a short jacket and skinny jeans, I think to myself. Fuck, my sister is so fucking annoying, Sam yells. She had all these people over last night drinking. We got in a fight. She was getting in my face and mouthing me off. She slapped me. What? I asked, shocked. Really? Holy, that's so intense. Yeah, Sam responds casually. I shoved her back. I hate when she brings all those people over. I didn't get to sleep till like 3. Man, that's a lot to deal with. I pause and then offer, if you ever want somewhere to stay when stuff like that's going down, you can stay with me. We have a spare room downstairs. Nah, it's all right. I'm used to it, she says as she stares out the window. I take a sip of my coffee, place it back in the cup holder and gear down and make the left turn off the highway towards the university. Sam breaks the silence with a story. I went to the dollar store yesterday. I was standing outside and snow slid off the roof and fell right down the back of my jacket. She starts talking faster and a little louder, rushing to the punchline. It's a funny story and she seems excited to share it with me. Straight down my neck hole, snow from the roof, she says. I laugh with her and say something lame that someone in their 30s would say, like, that's so lame. We pull up to the garage at the university where we've been making the moose. It's been warm the past few days, but it's cold now. The snow on the garage roof has melted and froze again. It's hanging off the gutters by about 3 feet. It looks like a riverbank that's been severely undercut by high waters, unstable. I notice a huge piece hanging right above the door and I point it out to Sam. She looks up from her phone. Oh shit, she turns to me wide-eyed, then smirks. I hope it doesn't fall on you. I hope it doesn't fall on you, I throw back. Lianne and Rosie, waiting. I stop. You can go keep it on the last slide, Scott. I stopped the truck at the gate outside the garage on the university campus. We've been working on the moose here for the past couple weeks. Rosie is in the passenger seat. She's She pauses the story she's telling me about a death in the community as I undo my seatbelt and go to get out of the car. I glance back at her and mumble, "Be right back." She looks small sitting there. Part of Rosie's daily hustle includes walking all over town, from social service to NGO and from community center to government building. She visits and rounds up vouchers, free formula, and free diapers from various charities and grocery store items from the food bank. Her tiny body, buried deep within a large hoodie and loose exercise pants, makes me think of a diet culture adage I've heard one too many times. If you want to lose weight, burn more calories than you consume. I hop out of the truck, then remember that there's ice under the fresh dusting of snow, so I walk cautiously. Ice below snow is a recipe for a broken wrist, and that's the last thing I need. I pull my glove off, grab the lock with my right hand, and fish out the gate keys with my left. Every second that I fumble to get the key in the lock, I feel as a burning sensation in my right hand. I think to myself that it would suck to die by freezing. I finally get the gate unlocked and go to push it open. There's a trick to the amount I can push. I've learned this from opening the gate countless times in the last few weeks. If I push too hard, the gate will bounce back and I'll have to walk it open, which is totally annoying in this temperature and with this much ice underfoot. I push it just right and it stays open. I smile to myself. It's a small victory. I get back in the truck. Rosie is texting. Her screen is cracked. I looked up the mouth of the Yukon River on Google Maps once. It splits off into a whole bunch of tiny waterways a few miles from the ocean. The aerial view of the river looks like a cauliflower or coral or Rosie's broken phone screen. The stories provide a glimpse into intimate moments between people who are just getting to know each other. While not of moose making directly, these vignettes illustrate how the moose brought us into a relationship with each other. These moments with Sam and Rosie reveal the challenges of everyday Indigenous life in the Yukon for women and gender nonconforming folks. There are several metaphors that help convey this story. Rosie and Sam's bodies, both small and buried beneath layers of clothing, to shield them from the constant pressure of a settler colonial environment around them. We're all affected by the overpowering and ever-present threat of winter, which could be read as colonialism in these. We all differ in our preparedness for the burden of colonialism/winter. Sam and her tracksuit jacket, Rosie with her thin exercise pants, me with my down jacket. My car becomes a refuge from the cold colonialism/colonialism. Sam and Rosie, both of whom do not have cars, Sam doesn't have a license, are transported from their lives in McIntyre and then through the portal that is my car to the moose making venue, another refuge. Uncertainty is present in both Sam and Rosie's life. Rosie needs to go from one state agency to another to support her family. There's uncertainty of where the next meal will come from for her and for her children. Sam's home life is unstable because of substance use, parties, and poverty. She's uncertain about what each night will bring, even in her own home. There were several settler participants in the project, and their involvement sparked some interesting theoretical and practical considerations within governance. You can change the slide, Scott, please. While resurgence theory has Indigenous peoples and practices at its core, Indigenous scholars are also keen to note that the work of decolonization and restoration of Indigenous lands, worlds, and futures requires engagement with settler allies. This project extends resurgence theory by taking seriously what creation-based governance looks like in a present that includes Indigenous and settlers in harm-free relationships with each other. Settler participants, for example, had integral roles and responsibilities in the production of the art project and played a key role in shaping our shared space and supporting the completion of the moose. It wasn't until, so the two settler participants are Abby and Gwen. Abby is an architect that she basically carved out the whole moose face out of styrofoam. And Gwen lives here in Whitehorse and is a good friend of mine and a new mom. Months after, so It wasn't until I interviewed Abby and Gwen months after we finished the project that we had a chance to talk about their experiences. And in my interview with Abby, I learned that at many times she felt awkward and navigated quite a bit of uncertainty. And she spoke specifically of Sam. I recall getting emotional in the interview with her, and reflecting on it now, I think it was because I felt bad for not doing something different to balance out the dynamic of the group and attend to her and her discomfort differently. To me, it emerged in that moment, emerged as a missed opportunity. But then when analyzing it, so now I'm hesitant to take responsibility for that missed opportunity. Gwen conveyed a similar regret in her interview. I regret actually not going deeper with Abby about that. We were consistently the two white people there. I wanted to ask her more questions. Can we talk about what this means for us? Can we talk about what this tells us? Like living here, you having a child here. Can we sit with this for a minute? I speak about the need to do that, and I didn't do it with her. So yeah, I'm regretful. Gwen identified a missed opportunity to educate and converse about their experiences as white people. Together, she and Abby could have supported each other's learning about power, privilege, whiteness, and working in Indigenous-centric spaces. She continues, self-educating with each other just before just expecting to be told or asking, oh, tell me what I don't know, give me more knowledge. I think it's something more responsible to do. It's more responsible to do that alone. Abby and I were sitting on the periphery, but in different spaces, and we could have had a moment where we connected. One of the things I learned from this experience after talking with Abby and Gwen about theirs is that not everyone knows how to be in Indigenous-centered spaces, let alone how to create them and sustain them. Gwen asks, what is an accomplice's role in holding the space for the center, but also not being part of that center and taking up that work with your own folks? Hunt and Holmes, reflecting on allyship and the responsibility to confront issues of power, take a closer look at roles individuals can play in intersectional friendships. Allyship within friendships does not always require reciprocity on the part of the individual who is socially marginalized. Instead, we suggest that allyship requires accountability on the part of the members of the dominant group and is not predicated on reciprocity by those who are marginalized. Gwen and I encountered this dynamic identified by Hunt and Holmes, but did not actualize it in real time. Reflecting on the experience now, I too was learning how to navigate whiteness within our familial governance group. My aim was to create an Indigenous-centric space and attend to the needs of the Indigenous participants. However, this also requires attending to whiteness in the sense that it is so ingrained in dominant social dynamics that is mistaken as the norm. In moments when I felt uncomfortable, it was because I was focusing on Indigenous members of the group at the expense of the white folks, and I felt guilty, like I was doing something wrong or that I was being rude. I think these were the feelings that came up between me and Abby. I didn't want to tell her, there was a moment where I avoided telling her. I basically told her, I lied about when we were starting our moose making session, and I told her that we were starting 2 hours later so that she wouldn't come. And I realized, because I wanted to hold this space for the Indigenous participants, and I realized that I didn't tell her because I didn't want to hurt her feelings, and that there was an element of white fragility that I was navigating. I was also navigating the fact that there are very few places and instances where white folks are told not to come. My desire was to attend to the Indigenous Center in the project, but with that came the task of attending to whiteness as well. Kanaka Maoli educator Julie Kaumea, after observing non-native participants in a Hawaiian language immersion class, outlines ways for settler folks to reflect on their responsibilities when entering Indigenous-centered spaces. She argues that this requires being attentive to how their presence changes the dynamic of the learning environment, tempering individual rights with an openness to communal values, and finally contributing to the community they are entering. Kaumea notes that this is aided by simply asking oneself, what is my place in this setting? What is my role or responsibility here? And is this the time and place for me to step forward, to step back, or to step out? Based on the experience we had moose making, I believe that there is more to this. Knowing when to step forward, step back, or step out requires a level of awareness and self-reflexivity that some settlers and white folks might not possess. And I think Abby in this work is an example of this. She felt it, but she could not name it, and largely she did not change her behavior. Gwen came into the moose making project with more experience in diverse work and learning environments, and with a background in working with and alongside racialized folks. This informed how she carried herself through the moose making project. Casey, my sister, one of the other Indigenous participants, reflecting on Gwen, noted some key traits in how she carried herself. I'll just try and do this quick, sorry. She's very outgoing and very personable and very kind and compassionate. And she noticed when there were times when I would notice when there were times when she would get a little quiet. But in my mind with her, I thought that she was allowing the space for whatever we were talking about to continue. Not that she didn't want to be part of it, it's that she was just giving us or allowing that space to continue, like not interrupting or intervening, which felt different to me than the way Abby was being part of it. So I claim that there's an additional layer, a layer that requires a particular kind of action. So when the lesson I learned from this experience is that I would go back and have conversations about the experiences that we were having in order to follow up and take action about like what we were seeing in the dynamics, and then address power, privilege, and whiteness a little bit more head on, if that was possible, and lean on others like Gwen to do the same, and perhaps identify those roles before the outset of a project. For Gertie's family, remember that interpersonal relations are a matter of life and death. The health and well-being and the physical, emotional, mental safety of the kin group was integral to the survival in the bush, and how we mirror that in Indigenous aesthetic practices is work that I think is future work for us. This presentation is rooted in the stories that Gertie shared about her life growing up around big salmon and guided by Northern Tutchone values within intimate relations. After completing the moose, I realized how much our familial groups were both guided by the moose. This chapter or this presentation is located opportunities for allyship, settler responsibilities, and reciprocity and accountability across axes of difference. Hunt and Holmes address the messy quality of decolonial projects and relationships. According to them, it is part of the process of unsettling dominant power dynamics and colonial ideologies. Our moose-making experience made these somewhat awkward and missed opportunities visible. It also demonstrated how interpersonal relationships and the challenges that come with them are at the heart of small-scale governance. The reality today is that our communities are diverse, and our governance structures need to attend to diversity with attention to how power operates and can be unsettled. Just because there's 2 minutes left, I am going to skip a little closing points for that. And I want to read you one last thing. So while a main tenet of resurgence theory is to facilitate Indigenous peoples' return to the land and land return to Indigenous people, this process is complex and not as straightforward as some resurgence theorists prescribe. Indigenous aesthetic practices facilitate building and sustaining colonial governance systems by making the transformative role of relationships very clear. Building and sustaining responsibility-based kinship connections as a basis of treaty relations means attending to everyday colonialism, healing, and whiteness. Indigenous futures include settlers, how they are brought into the folds of decolonization, and how they take up their self-education and learning largely falls to them. On the journey to building decolonial governance systems, Indigenous peoples will turn inwards towards each other, creating an Indigenous center. Settlers have a responsibility to care for that center. As such, co-creating Indigenous futures requires that settler folks learn to be attentive to Indigenous desires, funnel their skills and resources towards Indigenous needs, and decenter their needs and ideas of comfort. And just as a closing vignette, I'm standing at the moose's side. I have 50 pages of the UFA printed on hot pink paper in my hand. I begin to rip off the straight edges of each page and then tear the sheets across the blank spaces between the lines of text so that at least a few sentences will remain intact and readable. I make a large pile of treaty pieces and balance it on the sawhorse next to me. I open a can of wallpaper paste and dip my gloved right hand into its cool contents. I wipe the paste on the moose's body. I repeat the steps, dip my fingers in the paste, wipe my hand along the moose's body, add a piece of ripped treaty, dip my hand in more glue, and wipe it over the paper. My hand movements begin to feel fluid. The layers of ripped pieces start to blur into one another on the moose's body. It's difficult to tell where one clause ends and the other begins. The final wipe of glue on the growing UFA collage becomes a bigger arm movement across the side of the moose. As I do this, I feel his styrofoam ribs, the fullness of his hollow belly, the ridge of his wood spine connecting his shoulders and haunches. When I step back, the treaty looks whole again. The only evidence that it has been ripped and pieced back together is the abrupt end to sentences, the random missing words, and the scattering of non-sequential numbered clauses. Follow the moose, rip and paste, your hand can reconstruct. I take a few steps back, the text blurs and disappears. I take a few more steps back. His gold-painted styrofoam rack glints in the light and catches my eye. I see a moose. The end.
Lianne, that was amazing. That was a really beautiful presentation of your moose making work and of governance in action. Are you able to just answer two quick questions?
Sure. Yeah, and for those, I took up all the time. So for those of you who are able to stick around, it'd be great. But if you have to go, mâché for being here.
What's next in terms of your moose making? Are you making more moose? Are you expanding? What's happening?
Well, right now, the first thing that has to happen very soon is I have to get the moose out of the Yukon Art Center. It's in a box. I need to find a place for it. So I would love to have it at the Yukon University, for example, because of the findings, like how the art supports education and its pedagogical potential was really revealing through this work. So to have it in an educational institution, I think would feel really good. Yeah, there are other animal making projects in the future. A friend and I put in a proposal to make a herd of caribou out of plexiglass that is transportable and that will have stories etched or stickered onto them, caribou stories. So we'll see what happens there.
And then one other question that's coming from an audience member. They're just wondering about your own ancestry and lineages and how, embodying your Icelandic and Danish heritage alongside their Tutchone heritage, if that informed the development of this moose making process, having settlers and Indigenous working alongside. And they're also interested to know if this framework for art-based governance can be helpful for how to situate people who maybe don't fit into the Indigenous white settler binary.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it actually speaks to a component of the project that I didn't even address in this presentation, which is the methodology I used was collage. So the idea, like just think about collaging, cutting up pieces of paper and putting things that are seemingly different alongside each other. And then I theorized that. So I drew upon my own ancestry, having these collaged experiences of growing up away and returning, being schooled away and returning, being raised by a white mother, and reconnecting with the Indigenous side of my family. And then our Northern Tutchone governance practices and being collaged next to Euro-Canadian governance practices, and then coming into contact with each other. So all the pieces, the art pieces are literally collages, but then as theories, they allow us to see things next to each other that we might not consider having a relationship at all. And then out of that becomes layers and layers of meaning.
Yeah, that's true. Well, thank you so much for spending time and sharing your brilliance with us today. Best of luck with the dissertation defense, and we'll all be looking forward to the plexiglass caribou herd coming through our neighborhoods.
Right.
Thank you for everyone who tuned in today. We'll have the recording up on our website of Lianne's talk in the next few weeks. Please join us on November 3rd, 12 Mountain Standard Time. We're hosting Crystal Gale Fraser, who will be speaking on the histories of residential schools in the North during the era of reconciliation. So please share the poster widely, and we hope to see you all back here on November 3rd. Thank you so much, and stay safe, everyone. Bye now.
Merci.